I probably investigated at least 100 homicides in my 10-year career, and I don't remember the details of all of them. Those that I do remember, that's what I'll be presenting here on my channel. In 1973, I investigated one of the most unusual death scenes I ever remembered investigating. I received a call to respond to a parent double suicide. As I tell you what I found that day, see what conclusions we reached, and I want to know what conclusions you might have reached had you been there investigating. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be diving into a typical crime scene, or maybe not. I'll let you decide. As a crime scene investigator, when I would arrive on a scene, I did not know the story yet. I only knew what was in front of me. And sometimes what a scene first appears isn't what the evidence will ultimately show. So let's get started. Newspapers.com has been my valuable asset to help me rediscover many of the crime scene investigations I did back in the 1970s. I used the newspaper archives for preparing for my investigations. My memory serves me well, but I searched the local newspaper, the Palm Beach Post. I looked for details about the crime I investigated. But in order to search the newspapers, I need approximate date and the names of the victims or the suspect. Without this information, it's extremely difficult to search through the newspaper archives. What I did remember is that I did respond to a possible double suicide. I remember where the deaths took place. I know that the victims was a retired doctor and his wife. I recall that she was terminally ill with cancer and he had severe back and heart problems. The one thing that I would never forget or will never forget is the method of which they killed themselves, razor blades. Of the 100 homicides I may have investigated, I probably had just as many suicides, and this is the only homicide or suicide in which a razor blade was used. I remembered a lot, I just didn't remember their names, couldn't figure out the year or the month that I had investigated it. And again, without this information, searching newspapers.com to help bring back the investigation to my memory was extremely difficult. But I had a breakthrough in investigating my investigations. When I was going through an old box of PBSO crime scene stuff, yes, there are things I took with me, and yes, I still have them I left the sheriff's office 45 years ago. And sure enough, I found one black and white photograph of the victims in the position they were when I first saw them. But all that was written on the back of the photograph was a case number. But this I considered a breakthrough because now the case number was 73-12267. Well, based on the 73, that meant the year was 1973. And because of the 122667 number, I knew that was probably the middle of the year, the number of cases the sheriff's office would handle and case numbers assigned. Sure enough, I went into the Palm Beach Post archives and I found it. I searched using double homicide, suicide, because I didn't have the names, and I knew it took place in the town of Lantana. With that information, sure enough, I found the headline, which helped me identify the names, the date, and some facts that was reported in the newspaper that I had basically collected. I'm going to go one step further, something I had never done. I know there's a lot of information that's available to the public that didn't used to be back in the day. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Central Records, which ironically is where I started, they have an online presence in which the public can search for various types of criminal and civil records. So I took a stab. I logged in, created an account. I had the names of the victims. I had the case number. And within a few days, Sheriff's Office emailed me a copy of my Crime Scene Investigative report. As you can see here, this is exactly the way I received it, which it certainly doesn't look like a report or a piece of paper that was 53 years ago. Now let's walk through the scene together, just like I did. Now that I have my crime scene report, it confirms what my memory truly was, what I actually saw and did. First thing I always do is take a photograph of the outside of the crime scene, and as I enter, I take a photo through the entry of the door. They were on the 3rd floor of this condominium, and when I enter, describe in my report exactly what the scene looked like. So my scene was the interior of a 1-bedroom, 1-bath condominium on the 3rd floor, located in the town of Lantana, right near the Intercoastal Waterway. The condominium was extremely neat. There was nothing out of place. There was almost like nobody lived there. Everything was put away in the kitchen, the bedrooms, the bathroom. It was extremely neat. On the dining room table were the stacks of envelopes and letters. The lead investigator of the case, he took over those items, and then I proceeded to examine the bodies. Both the bodies were in the bedroom. There were twin beds with the male lying on one twin bed and the female lying on the other twin bed. The beds were pushed together. They weren't touching one another. Both victims were lying on their back. The gentleman, a retired doctor, I was accurate in my description, he was lying on his back with no sheets covering him and dressed only in a pair of boxer shorts. The female, on the other hand, had a blanket covering her. She was in a pink nightgown, and she was obviously wearing a wig, which confirms most likely that that was from her cancer treatment. And they looked like they were sleeping. However, since the gentleman wasn't covered up, his left wrist or his left hand was in a plastic bag, and it had a strip of cloth tying the bag tight around his forearm. When I opened the plastic bag, I could tell that his left wrist had been slit. He had been bleeding. There were a large number of towels and washcloths beneath his wrist, which had absorbed all the blood. The female, when I uncovered her right wrist was in a very similar situation. Her right hand was in a plastic bag, been tied with a piece of cloth, and when I cut open that plastic bag, her right wrist had been cut, and it appeared to be a sharp instrument, most likely a razor blade, and also beneath her wrist were towels and washcloths that had soaked all the blood. Further examining the bedroom, there was nothing. There were some pills on the dresser and the clothes where they normally would be. When I went into the bathroom, it was spotless, folks. On the counter next to the sink was one single edge razor blade. On the counter next to the razor blade is what I describe in my report, a red substance appearing to be blood. I also noted in my report that on the door jamb outside the bathroom was also a red substance appearing to be blood. That was it. There was no blood on the floor anywhere else but what I've just described, and the rest of the blood was in the towels where apparently both of them bled to death. After photographing the scene, doing a brief sketch, I collected the drugs that were there, the prescription medicine, I should say properly, and then I proceeded to talk to the lead investigator. And at this point, I'll share with you what he had learned. The bodies were discovered about 1 p.m. by a neighbor who lived next door. He had a key, and he noticed that they had not picked up their morning newspaper. He let himself inside, made the discovery, and called law enforcement. The notes and letters I mentioned that were on the dining room table, there were 7 pages of typewritten notes explaining and instructing relatives and friends. There was an envelope addressed to the police, the funeral director. There was even a note to the gentleman that found them, said in part, take what's in the refrigerator and freezer, and here's $10 to put the shutters up on the condominium. We learned that the water for the residents had been requested to be shut off. Also learned from the other investigators that their wills had been completed in January, this is May, and that their house in Michigan, where they lived before they retired to Florida, that house in Michigan had just been recently sold and they had closed on it. You know, my role as a crime scene investigator is not to prove any kind of theory. I strictly arrive to preserve what there is so evidence can tell the story. Remember what I told you at the beginning, that the original call was for an alleged double suicide? Well, classification made by the lead investigators and the medical examiner, the determination was officially called a homicide-suicide. The letters were both signed by both victims. So what do you think? The wife was terminally ill with cancer. The retired doctor had reportedly suffered from severe back trouble and heart issues. As I just mentioned, both of them had signed the letters that were written. The physical evidence indicated that the doctor had cut his wife's wrist and then his own. One of the indicators of this would be he was right-handed, which we knew. He cut the right wrist of his wife and then used the same razor blade, apparently, to cut his left wrist. Legally and officially, it was classified as a homicide. 53 years later, would we look at these circumstances any differently? Was it a murder-suicide? Maybe some would call it a suicide pact, something we might also call a assisted suicide. But you know, I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not sure we even try to find out what was going on. The evidence tells us what happened. It doesn't necessarily tell everything that was in the minds of this retired doctor and his wife the night that they killed themselves. And maybe that's another reason why, after investigating years of crime scenes, evidence can tell a great deal, but they can't always tell you why. Thank you for stopping in. Please feel free to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Thanks again. Bye-bye.